Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining our CKAN Monthly Live number 33. We are super happy to have you with us from all the different time zones. This session is a very interesting, special, and I'd say unique one. We are joined by Rufus Pollock, someone who truly needs no introduction in this space, I believe, but I'll give him one anyway. So Rufus is the original creator of CKAN. He is founder of the Open Knowledge Foundation. He is current president at the Ethiopian and a long thought leader in the global open data movement. Over the past 2 decades, his work has shaped how governments, institutions, and civil society think about data transparency and the infrastructure of public knowledge. And today we have the honor to have him here, and he will talk about not only technology, but he will reflect on why CKAN was built in the first place, what it has taught him, and what kind of tools and mindsets we need for the future. So before I give the mic to Rufus, I have a few housekeeping items, as always. So the agenda for today is welcome and introductions. This is me right now talking. Then I made a quick rearrangement, by the way, Bob. I know you're here, but let's do the post-project announcements after the presentation, if you don't mind. That's fine. That's cool. Thank you. So after the introduction, we're going to have the presentation from Rufus. Then, as always, we will open the floor for Q&A session. After that, we can have the post-project announcement, then community announcements and sharing, and at the end, closing remarks. As you know, we have a meeting notes document. It is pinned in the chat. This is our single source of truth document. This is our cheat sheet. You can open it. You can write down your name, affiliation, what brings you to CKAN. And you can also drop your thoughts for future meetups or agenda suggestions. There are 2 ways to ask a question. You can either raise a hand and go ahead, or you can drop your question in the chat. We have a CKAN Monthly newsletter. As you know, you can subscribe for it through this presentation that you see on screen and on our website as well, or on LinkedIn. It's monthly, we don't spam, it's quite interesting, so you can subscribe to get the insights. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive in. Rufus, the floor is yours. You should be able to share your screen. I will stop sharing right now.
Okay, thank you. Let me. Yay. How amazing. It kind of goes out of slideshow. Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Joanna, for the introduction. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me here. It's really great to share. I should say I was a kind of late minute addition to the running order because I think there's been a delayed presentation, so I'm jumping in a little bit here impromptu. And in that vein, today's talk that I'm gonna give is quite reflective. It's going to be less on any of the kind of nuts and bolts, anything, the big picture and context for me around CKAN, and a little bit of my own personal journey. I hope it's kind of interesting in that regard. But if any, there won't be as much detail or specific thoughts immediately on the day-to-day of CKAN. But I think it's kind of fun to kind of step back sometimes and take the 20,000-foot view. I think I'm surprised I'm even described as a veteran now of open data. It's true that now I've been involved in this area for like 25 years, pretty much almost. 2001, 2002 was when I started getting involved in what became open data type area and Open Knowledge Foundation. Open Knowledge Foundation, I think its 20th anniversary was last year. It was founded in 2004. So yeah, it's really kind of amazing to be here. And I'm going to skip, I think, because Joanna did such a good job. I think we can skip. People probably know a little bit, and Joanna did such a generous job of introducing me. Let's get right into it. So as I said, I am I'm the president and founder of Datopian. I'm the founder of Open Knowledge Foundation, and also the co-founder of Life Itself, which I'll talk about maybe a tiny bit at the end here. There's a kind of connection for me in my mind between that project and this one. And one question, I mean, maybe people can just put their hand up, I don't know, or they can just vote in the chat, but I don't know, one interesting question at the very beginning is who's heard of the term sense making? I'd never heard of the term sense making, until, I got into this other area, but it's kind of an unusual term. I normally think, what the hell is that? So just interested, who knows that term, but you can just note it in the chat. So I kind of start for myself at the beginning. And so this is the late 90s. You can therefore work out my age. I'm a teenager, and I don't have access to the internet, by the way, in those days. Those days I had to get books. My parents didn't let me get online early. And I was reading about things in the late 90s at this point, I guess. And I was a really, really curious child. I was constantly asking chess questions. I've now got a young child who's doing the same thing to me. So a lot of whys, from when I was really young, but by this point I was asking other questions. I remember one was I started came across this book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, which is actually now quite a bit of a kind of, I wouldn't quite say a bestseller, but really quite well known. It was written, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s. At that point, it's pretty obscure. You had to get it secondhand. And, he was kind of telling these stories about just looking at civilizations that had collapsed. And in fact, obviously, most civilizations in human history had gone through a kind of collapse event. There's Roman Empire, there's the Mayans, many, many others. And then other questions, there was a point where people started talking about the environment. They'd been talking, obviously, the 70s, and again about population. So I was reading these books like Feeding the World by Fackler Smil. He's gone to write many other books, and books like How Many People Can the Earth Support by Joel Cohen. So this is something I was quite a rationalist of population had doubled, it was going to maybe double again. We were going to go over 10 billion people. Was this going to be okay? And I'm giving this as one example of a question where I was kind of in mind, well, we needed data. I was someone who I want to go out, find, if you're going to answer this question, well, we need data sets. These kind of books are quite data heavy if you go read them. But what's kind of surprising if you read them is often it's quite hard to answer the question. Data is maybe not available, or it's difficult to get. I remember, data sets in the back of the Joel Cohen book were kind of, there was some kind of typed pages in the old days, tables. And I started to kind of be this question of why was it so hard to get hold of the information we needed to answer the questions that mattered to us? Now, my question is maybe this question. Maybe for someone else, it's just what's the quickest way to get to work? Or, what's the tallest building? Whatever those are, there was this kind of point of well, it was hard to get information, to get the data to answer the questions I was interested in. They were often, it was when you actually want to look, for example, when are we going to run out of fossil fuels? You could go and find reports, but they might cost $10,000 or $20,000. I found reports that cost that amount of money from experts in the oil industry. So there's this kind of aspect that information wasn't really very well. And this was this point of kind of curiosity hitting a wall. Even in my case, I was kind of really privileged, right? I could go buy books. In those days, the books were expensive. The kind of dawn of the internet for everyone. So I just generally found that I didn't have data to answer questions frequently. And that kind of came up a lot. I could go into any area. I started doing work in climate. There was early actually open climate work going on. And then this is the mid 2000s, just really frequently, any area you went to, you found that data was often unavailable, or it was expensive, or it was restricted, or it just didn't exist. And then the other aspect was when you did have data, hard to put it together. It's fragmented, it's different formats, it's in PDFs, just all of that stuff that people in this community just know so much about. And the other aspect for me that I haven't mentioned here was sort of getting kind of open source pilled. So in the late when I went to university, I went to Cambridge University, and suddenly I had the internet, and suddenly I kind of had a friend who was into computer science. I discovered Linux. I like installed Linux. You know, it was only been on Windows before that, and you know, there's just an incredible, you know, open source and free software frankly, as it was called then mostly, was just blew my mind. You know, it was so amazing that I could like download an entire operating system and like mess around with it. I remember like working out how I can install Postgres, you know, and so on, like a sysadmin my own machine. And the inspiration of free and open source software movement was that this kind of basically distributed community, I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, was creating entire, you know, software systems. And in particular, you know, I was installing Debian, and people have used Debian, you know, this apt-get, there's this package management. Package management is incredible because it's not, there's people who've created the software, but then there's this whole set of people who are basically making the software run together on my machine. You know, there's Firefox, but someone's packaged Firefox to run on Debian or on Ubuntu. And I was like, why couldn't we have this for data? You know, this was the original, like, wow, open source is incredible. It's really productive environment, ecosystem for basically collaborating and just breaking problems up. You know, I don't have to build the whole of an operating system. People can build lots of different parts and put them together, and different apps, and they can come together. Wouldn't that be possible for data? And, you know, these two things were coming together in the kind of open knowledge vision, which is, you know, we needed the data, we needed open access to data, but we also needed tooling and infrastructure. And there's obviously many other people as well. I mean, there was Wikipedia, there were many projects I was part of. At one point, I think about 8 different, I was a member of, I ran Creative Commons UK, I was part of FFII, I was part of many organizations, but I founded Open Knowledge in 2004. And one of the first things we worked on basically was CKAN. And I think like the actually very first kind of versions of CKAN were written in 2005. And why the name? I don't know if people know this, but you know, CKAN is named CKAN because of CPAN. So nowadays it just shows you history. I don't know how many people actually heard of Perl nowadays, but once upon a time, Perl was like a big deal, like bigger even than Python. And there was this thing called CPAN, the Comprehensive Perl Archive Network. And it was basically the package archive, the software library archive for Perl. And it had this kind of cool name, CPAN. And so that was CKAN, was the Comprehensive Knowledge Archive Network. And the dream at the very beginning was like, you know, wow, we're just going to spin up, you know, basically this catalog. People start publishing data set packages. You know, there'll be more open data, and then we'll do this packaging, and we'll have all the tooling that we have in data, and hey presto, we'll be off to the races. And that was the first version, was actually like basically a wiki. I mean, you know, was built in Moin. So again, I don't even know if Moin is still around, but it was the go-to Python wiki back in the day. So, you know, one of my big rules in life is never build something from scratch first yourself. You must always use someone else's tool till destruction, till it doesn't work for you anymore. Because one of the great temptations of developers, and at least used to be kind of a developer, is to build. We love building things. You know, you love inventing and creating code. But yeah, the first version was in Moin, and then it kind of converted over to Python. You know, initially pylons, and the very first version, like I would say, 1.0 of CKAN.net and the CKAN software was kind of released in 2007. It'd been running before that and was online, but we launched at the Creative Commons International Summit in Dubrovnik, which, yeah, was an amazing time. Dubrovnik is an amazing city. And yeah, so, and at the beginning, one of the things to understand is there was no real desire to build CKAN software in the sense of, it was open source, of course, people could use it. And actually a few people, mainly from the nascent data science industry, data science and the data world was kind of taking off around 2007, 2008, 2009. And I remember like InfoChimps, which I think may still exist as a company, came along and wanted to kind of use some of the software and take a load of at least the data set catalog. But basically it was to run CKAN.net. It was to run this this thing. And that's today, CKAN.net, by the way, if you don't know, it's datahub.io, like in the sense of a site for, you know, creating a kind of archive and they're all frictionless data sets and data packages. That dream lives on there. But CKAN's kind of emergence as a piece of software in its own right really happened around 2008, 2009, 2010, when there was a sudden breakthrough after many years of kind of pushing at the door. Suddenly, Obama was elected. In the UK, there was this coalition government that was elected, and transparency was a big deal. And some of those people came along, those governments, others, and were like the first reusers of CKAN, saying like, hey, we want something yesterday. This already is working. We know, I knew some of the people, certainly in the UK government, and that was where CKAN started to get reused as a piece of software in its own right, around basically 2009, 2010. And then there were many countries we went to, people came along, and a real movement began. And there's this kind of global adoption. Like, so CKAN as the incredible project and I think also kind of community that it is today really started to develop. There were multiple instances being deployed. Sometimes at one point, like 2010, one every not quite week, but certainly every month, from Canada to Finland to Australia, and also like a major just shift. I think a major like CKAN 2.0. Thanks to many people, some of whom are still here. Adria has been here almost from the beginning of this. But this major development from 2010 to really 2012, 13, 14, of where CKAN really matured as a piece of software, and became, I would say, it was also facing this kind of competition from proprietary software providers, some of whom are still around, some of whom are not. But this real evolution to become mature, pretty usable, a mature product, the plugin system. And I think then from that point taking off, really, there's been incredible work, since then. And just as people know, I mean, CKAN is a really significant piece of work now. And not just CKAN, but for example, I just call out Stephen. I remember, Stephen coming along, all the work to share about it. One of the learnings for me in my life is that sadly, it's not true that if you build a better mousetrap, the world will be to pass your door, as the phrase goes. You need to also share about it, market it. And, among many people have to do it. I want to call out Stephen as well, co-steward, as one of the people who's been kind of leading in that, and in kind of championing the vision of open data infrastructure. And there's obviously also like this kind of explosion. I don't want to talk again today, this time, but it's from around the late 2000s, early 2010s. There's this explosion in both the broader open data ecosystem and data ecosystem in general. This is the big data science, the beginnings. There was no even term for data engineering at that point. And there's this real evolution. And I think one of the things that said at the very start of the talk is the kind of dream for me, at least, and in our mission statement at Datopian, is about democratizing the power of data, through quality open data and data infrastructure. And this is a point where the growth of data infrastructure starts happening. I guess I would say that it's still a very mixed bag. I would like to see, personally, there's been huge amounts of open source data infrastructure, but the dream of really like the apt get for data, the data management and like code management, it's getting there. But I guess I wouldn't have bet that I'd still be here 20 years later and it would be there. I think there's many things in that. I mean, it's true that software took 50 years, frankly, if you think of the early 50s. And really, in terms of data, we're starting the 80s, really. Data is behind software for various reasons. But there's been broad evolution. I said I don't want to say too much about that. There's been many things that have happened. But today CKAN, I think, is this like mature, powerful, extensible platform. It's the world's leading, you could even drop open source, but I think the world's leading data management system, certainly the world's leading open source data management system, and used, as we know, all over the world. And just had so, as I said, many people, hands have played a really major role in this happening. And I think it's inspiration for what we could have generally. Now, in the second part of this, because again, I know I've got very limited time today, to watch my time, it's a little bit to say, to go a bit further afield. And whether this is my own personal just reflections, which is one of the things was that one is the context going all the way back to the late 90s for me, and reading that book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, was growing awareness, which I now use the term, and other people use the term sometimes, meta-crisis, which is this real awareness of the fragility and that's growing breakdown of the systems that we were using for global civilization. So one obviously is the ecological crisis that we've been encountering, and the climate crisis, but the passing of planetary boundaries in various ways, and this tension between material growth and the biosphere. But there are others, for example, around technology governance. Ever since the 1945, with the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, we've been confronting the fact that we as humans have technological powers sufficient to destroy ourselves and destroy the world. And this is also the case with, for example, potentially things like AI. And so what I would term like this wisdom gap problem, where our technology has kind of taken off, but our capacities as human societies to govern and manage them has not accelerated, or maybe even grown at all sufficient to manage them. And so one context over the last 20 years or more for me is this growing awareness and concern. And the meta crisis for me is a bit specific. It's not only that there's this crises that are emerging that interrelate, but that the kind of underlying drivers of them, or the underlying sources of them, which is the meta part of the crisis, lie very deep in our civilization. They lie in our ways of being, in our culture, in the value systems we have. For example, in core parts of capitalism are the idea of, we just need to keep growing. And while that's brought really amazing things, I'm very grateful for modern medicine and many other things in science and technology. It's also brought this aspect of, just ever more. And there's this crisis is really profound because it goes to the roots of our civilization. So that's one kind of context. And what they're related to was part of the motivation for me around open data and the open knowledge foundation was this dream that if we had more data, we had more tools for working with data, we could kind of make knowledge and insight, and then from that would come action. The classic, okay, more data, more analysis, more insight, more action. And that just isn't quite so. That's kind of obviously, that wasn't like a new news to me right at the beginning, but I think it became more and more powerfully clear. And things like the climate crisis, for example, where people talk about the fact that it's just really clear there's not a lack of information. People know maybe what's happening, but it doesn't really land. That the data, the information doesn't necessarily turn into insight and knowledge and then action for a variety of reasons. And, maybe, you could say information without meaning creates even confusion. Openness requires open minds. So just because you have access to knowledge doesn't mean it changes your mind. In fact, there's a load of psychological research showing sometimes the opposite, that there are these things called like backfire effects, where if someone thinks something strongly, like, I don't know, Obama was not born in the United States, but was actually born somewhere else, so he couldn't be president of the United States. Even if you show them evidence like the birth certificate and things like that, they'll like just believe it more. So there seem to be some quite deep things going on. And I was a Zen Buddhist, I am a Zen Buddhist. And so I was very maybe already interested in these aspects of like, why don't we change our mind? What is the nature of it? So this brings me to this kind of idea of sense making as a term, where this is kind of idea of understanding. When I first heard the term, what is that? Well, understanding is a kind of rational connotation for me, at least. Okay, I'm going to have some information, knowledge. I'm going to kind of understand it, and I'm therefore maybe going to change my mind, or update my beliefs. And this term sense making, one potential origin is Carl Weick, this sociologist, brilliant sociologist, and he tells this story about From Young Men and Fire, which is an amazing book. It's about a forest fire in, I think, 1949 in the US, in Montana. And what happens is 13 people, you can see on the cover of this book, in those days, they're actually parachuted in. They're dropped into the fire to basically help stop it. And the idea in those days is, if you can stop a fire quite early on, it's actually, you can cut a break. Fires don't move that quickly. They can kind of contain or manage the fire. But this fire becomes kind of like 1 in 100-year event. Something happens to the fire. We actually don't really know what, because in the end, most of these people died. But the fire somehow took off, and it became a fire that was moving with wind very quickly, at a point ultimately faster than you could run. All of these people were very fit young men, and they basically ended up, the fire essentially chasing them up a hill. And essentially only one person of this whole group survived. And this person had this idea, which he'd known about from other circumstances, which is you can basically burn, if you start a fire where you are, the fire kind of spreads around you and it burns up the ground, and then you can kind of lay down in where you've burnt a fire, and then when the other fire comes, it doesn't burn where you are. You've already burnt all the grass. And he basically stopped up this hill and did this, and he survived. And all the other people, some of them actually like ran past him, and he was like shouting them like, sit down with me, and they kind of just kept going. And Weir's question was like, what, in that moment when you're running up that hill with a fire at 60 miles an hour kind of coming up the hill behind you, how are you making sense of the world? How are you making decisions about, is this guy who's like stopped here making a fire crazy, or does he know what he does? How do you start deciding where like knowledge is coming from in a sense? And while this is an extreme circumstance of how we make sense of the world, like how do we decide where epistemological authority comes from? Like who has knowledge? Is it the government telling us about taking vaccines, or is it what I'm reading on Joe Rogan? Or like where does authority and intellectual knowledge authority come from? And who do I listen to? And how do I even make sense of the world? How do I decide what's going on with that fire behind me? Now, that might seem an extreme circumstance, but actually we're doing this quite a lot in our lives. We're making sense, and particularly in moments of profound change, or where our existing frames of reference and ways of thinking about the world are breaking down. That is really relevant. And this is perhaps one of the things that I saw, is that in general, this whole, the whole model of like, you're going to give people information and data, and then they're going to act on it, just often didn't happen. Like, why? I was engaged a lot with policymakers, right? Really smart people in government, and frequently they didn't act in a very rational way, in my view. And they weren't being stupid, but they were making sense. They were dealing with the daily news cycle, or how would this play with this interest group? And so this idea of sense making, that people take in knowledge and make sense of it, interpret it within the frames and systems they have, was very interesting. And so there's this kind of move from, in myself in my life, well, I'm still very interested in how we build data infrastructure. I still spend a lot of time doing that, how we build what I would call tools for sense making in a broader sense, from everything from how do we build better knowledge bases to better data catalogs. But then there's all of these there's these other aspects on top of that for sense making. How do we make sense together? How do we decide what to do about COVID? How do we decide whether a vaccine is safe for us or not? How do we decide what to do about the climate crisis? How do we decide what to do about corruption, or if corruption is happening in my country? How do we decide what politician to trust or not trust? All of these things. How do we do those individually and especially collectively, given that no one of us has the ability to make these kind of choices on our own? I don't get to do all the experiments in a textbook. I don't know what. I didn't get to look in an atomic microscope. I didn't get to look at the stars. My whole world is made up of knowledge that's based on of others. And then finally, those capacities, I feel, I know this is the kind of top of the pyramid, maybe it should be the bottom, but the kind of inner development, how do we build those capacities? Well, there's this aspect of community and personal growth. Now, this is well outside of what CKAN is doing, but what I'm trying to articulate is that if we have a holistic vision of why we're committed to open data, or why we're interested in open data, why we're interested in building better data infrastructure, for me, it was always because I wanted to empower more people to make choices for themselves, to make sense of the world for themselves, to participate as citizens in the world and in companies, but to empower them to make better choices. And that one of the things is that this requires, I think, this whole of this pyramid, ultimately. Now, different people, of course, work on different things. But that's what led me, for example, to Life Itself, the organization I found in 2015, after I got to hand over open knowledge to the team, the wonderful team there. So that's maybe a little bit of a thing. So the next layer of the stack, we have multiple layers of our stack. And I think this is putting the layers together, if we want to use that technical way of thinking about it. Putting together the layers of the stack is really, really important if we actually want to ultimately have the impact we want to have. Now, there isn't a call, by the way, for us to go, people here to go and spend a lot of time doing sense making, but it shows, I think, a context for the work that we're doing, and also maybe a way of thinking about the tools that we're building, how and why we build them. So, how do, for example, just to finish as an example, like how more and more can we build into CKAN, as we've been doing, tools for telling data stories, for telling narratives, for, setting data in context. I don't come to a data set, but maybe I have some context for that data set, or there's some, narrative behind it, or at least documentation, all of these kind of things. Maybe there's small things that show up in the technical architecture, but which relate to all of this. So yeah, I want to say a big thank you for your time and attention. There should be some time for Q&A. I haven't really even got to touch on AI as much as I would have liked to, given the time constraints today. I could say, well, I was in the side titles, that would be another whole talk, but I can talk about it because obviously that's kind of at this intersection of data and sense making and knowledge. But yeah, a big thank you, and I really, really appreciate the time today with you all. Let me stop my sharing.
Thank you, Rufus. Let's open the floor for a Q&A session.
Yeah, I could touch on the AI aspect, Eric. Thank you. Maybe I'll take a question and come on that one.
So, Sanyai, if you hear me, please, you can have your question. Maybe not.
Once he comes off mute, maybe I say, given I feel I had a question from Eric about the AI, I mean, obviously, I think AI in this area generally, and in our societies as a whole, is this seismic event. And I could talk more broadly. I think I want to flag that at the very beginning. Obviously, the question relates even to the meta crisis. Whether there's even like some Terminator-like event from AI, or whether it's even a much more subtle erosion of our kind of autonomy, our ability to have a say, whether it through manipulation or other features. There's many things to think about, as well as the wonderful things from AI. Just in the simplest way, I think one of the things from recently, and I think someone mentioned Daniel Schmachtenberger, we at Life Itself collaborate with the Center for the Civilizational Research Institute, Daniel Schmachtenberger and Zach Stein. We just ran a conference in Harvard on the meta crisis 2 weeks ago. And one of the things just talked about there was, imagine your children brought up by an AI tutor, which is very much the imagined future, right? And there's no problem if we want to use AI to augment education, but imagine a child, and they're going to end up relating to that entity as kind of another person. Leaving apart things is if the company decides to cancel their subscription, whatever. I know people have ever had kids with a pet animal, what it's like. But what would it mean to allow a generation of our children to be socialized by AI? Look what happened with social media, which was kind of hey, let's just give social media to our kids and see what happens. Which we now have a lot of evidence that that could have been done a lot more wisely and a lot more carefully. You've got the Surgeon General of the United States putting out health warnings like there are on tobacco, basically for social media now. It's a risk of depression, anxiety, all of these things. So I just want to have this bigger context, which is that in the same to go back to the point of why did open data matter, why does data infrastructure matter, and why do capacities for sense making matter, this is one of the biggest choices. How do we govern and manage the arrival of this technology in our society is one of the biggest things that humanity has confronted. And I don't think we're doing great at the moment about it. But the bigger thing is in this area. Let's dive down to more CKAN and all this stuff. I think so. There, it's one level is to say you've got this immensely powerful technology, and which is also a general purpose technology, in the sense that the evidence we're seeing so far about most AI models is that generic models, basically the larger and your model is, that dominates being specialized. So there's this huge, it's not like you're going to have a multipolar world where there's an AI that's really good at math, and there's an AI that's really good at English, and then there's an AI that's really good at coding. Yes, there's cursor.dev and there's things tooling that integrates them, but essentially we see a world in which basically the largest model tends to win to some extent, crudely. And that brings up issues that were there also at the heart of starting CKAN and other things, which is we want to democratize the power of technology and data technology if possible, for a variety of reasons, because it's good for innovation, because when we actually democratize technology, as we did with the internet, we get the most amount of innovation we've ever seen. How much innovation did you see on top of Facebook compared to the internet? It's a simple comparison. You didn't see a lot on top of Facebook. There's some, you got Farmville, but compared to internet, you didn't get nearly as much. But secondly, it's about power and democracy. Technology brings immense power and control. There was a famous paper about Google being able to change an election if it wanted to. If Google back in the day, maybe not so relevant now anymore, but if 10 years ago, Google could basically shift an election. If they manipulated the search results people found, they did an experiment, quite a rigorous experiment. They showed that Google could change an election. Facebook could change an election. That is too much power, in my view, that any one company that is not under democratic supervision should have. And this is happening with AI. There's immensely powerful technology. We're in a world where at the moment it looks like there's this race, and it tends to be dominated. While there are companies, there is obviously a very vibrant open AI ecosystem, but in general, because of the cost and so on and so forth, it is tending to happen inside of basically closed source companies and closed infrastructure companies. So I think that's another thing where there's this immense need for us. And then the other aspect, the positive aspect, having said some of the warning, was the immense positive. I think that AI and open data particularly, but AI and data generally, it's a real game changer. I mean, just if you've built data portals for as long as we have, and other people may on this call have done, the bane of many data portals is poor quality metadata, data sets without visualizations, data set without context, or conversely, how much work it is to take data sets and create data stories. These are things that now, at least in our both within, I think we're working within CKAN, also we've done work, sometimes experimental work at Datopian, is really possible, like, automatically adding metadata, cleaning up metadata. So immense improvement in the quality of data set production. And that's been a big gap. I mean, classically, this dream of like the data packages never quite happened, right? We often have like a lot of raw data sort of published, but the quality of that data is often not that it's bad data, like the data is inaccurate, but it's in different formats, it's messy, it's this place. And so using AI and or I guess the support of AI in those kind of workflows, I think is an immense opportunity, and something that is happening. But I think there's a lot to do there. And I think there's a lot of like human plus AI stuff there, because there's often contextual knowledge, expertise around data sets and so on. There's domain expertise. And I think, Augusto's comment here, I don't know if Augusto is a long-term collaborator with Open Knowledge and expert, I think, in these areas, is absolutely right also that I still think, ironically though, data quality is still low. And obviously the great final risk, which is on a lot of this, and this is why I kind of keep coming back to wisdom to finish with, is AI also helps us generate a lot of it can generate both good stuff, but obviously we can use it to spam or other things like that. We can use to cause ourselves lots of problems. I should stop there, I think, in terms of time. Again, there's a lot more that could be said, but I would like to see if there are any more questions. And also we've got to come to the sharing of updates and things like that. So I want to make sure, Joanna, that we're on.
Yeah, so I can see Mohsen is raising his hand. So please go ahead. Then Stephen.
Hey!
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you very much to see you, Rufus. And we started from your open data ecosystem idea term that you coined. Yeah, and we were working like from last 4 years on this open data ecosystem, exploring all the points that have you mentioned on the production of open data side and on the usage side. And we have this all the things that you mentioned. AI, as we said, it's the new era of open data usage. We use AI for data and data for AI, both terms that we use. So thank you very much for this interesting. Yeah. So my question is, I don't have any particular question, just to mention that we are building something on open data ecosystem already. I said in the chat. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great.
And me?
Yes.
I just wanted to point out, so we do have the croissant integration. So Adria's working on that with the ML Commons folks. So that's really a profile that will help people understand the lineage and sort of qualities of different data sets appropriate for machine learning. So, and CKAN pretty much primed and ready for the kind of integrations you would have for like the model context protocol and the agentic type data acquisitions and pipelines like that. And I think the other thing to just remember now that although CKAN grew out of open data, there's a lot of institutions and organizations that are using it just for data governance, data management, and that light touch open source capability it has with all those interoperable components and ways of getting the data in there and making it discoverable. And the academic use cases as well for fair, so findable. Yeah.
You're so right.
I've got an A. Interoperable and reusable.
Accessible. But I think you're so right, Stephen. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so the future is really one of the points you mentioned, Rufus, was more data, more analysis, and more action. The thing is, like, it is still there. We do need more data. You would never say that you've got enough books in your library or enough areas of study to follow everyone's curiosities, right? So we do need more data, and we can't really kind of fall back and say, well, if we don't have any sense around the data, we don't have anything, because there's always chickens and there's always eggs, and we need to work on both ends of that production line, right? And I think what CKAN does do, it does democratize the ability for anyone to start at any level just on their laptop, and they can deploy all the way up to enterprise. So I think the story from 2002, 2004 to 2009 to the big pickup with the national institutions and the federal institutions to today, the deployability of CKAN across all the different sort of domains where it's being used is why it's a perennial product. It's why it's going to be around for another 25 years. And whilst AI may have like a very, very strong future into the future as well, the way we operate with knowledge as individuals is going to have that close touch, personal sort of reflection, right? So the tools that we use, you don't want to be black box. You want them to be as personal, as open as you might need to be yourself, or for those of you who collaborate with, as you may need with others. So I think that's the main big difference that we have with CKAN today.
Yes. I want to say something that you're really pointing out that I didn't, again, I had to cut some things on the slide, but the period I'd say from 2014 to 2020, particularly, I mean, and well, till now, but particularly that period was, I think, this breakthrough also, as you said, into enterprise and other things where people started to say, oh, okay, this thing started out maybe for open data portals. I think this is true, you know, but basically just because governments had actually the biggest, some of them's data catalogs and were most willing to share, but many enterprises started to say, maybe I'm not sharing with the world, but I'm sharing certainly in my organization, and I need to make sense of this data. I think another point you were getting at, Stephen, that I'd also say is the switch as this, well, of course, you always want more data. I think in many organizations, there's been this moment of like, okay, I've got data, but this organization, you know, if I actually have too much, I'm lost, you know, without a catalog, without ways to find, discover, organize. And in many places we've kind of passed that hump where I think one of that things is the kind of infrastructure is now the kind of bottleneck in some cases, and why CKAN is so crucial and so valuable is I think it's one, you know, it's this tooling and a multi-purpose kind of tooling for building data infrastructure and data management in the enterprise, in non-profits, in academia, and in government.
Okay, thank you. Oleg, you can go ahead if Stephen is.
Thanks very much, Rufus, for those thoughts. I've noticed we haven't talked about federation for a long time. I'm wondering if you kind of think basically, you know, model, you know, these MCP protocols, you know, AI harvesting is basically replacing federation. If we're kind of inadvertently or not giving up on the technical difficulties of semantic web of RDF, you know, structured data extraction, and just going full throttle into this, you know, the structuring happens later, pushing down the pipeline, so to speak. And basically, yeah, how do you see, what's your vision for how we really federate CKAN going forward?
Well, I want to say, first of all, that there might be other people have both opinions and expertise on this than me. So I'm just going to offer my 2 cents, which is federation is a political and a technical issue and a user experience issue. So the issue is that federation is in some ways politically attractive, right? Because we don't need to centralize. If we're in the UN or any other entity or government departments, we don't need to have one data catalog, for example. We can have multiple ones. We can do federation. This is often, you know, a politically and socially attractive approach. The challenge is that from a user point of view, at least a data consumer, I now either have to have like one central portal that does the federation and the consolidation, which is painful, or I've got some actual federated search, like a proper federated search. Like I haven't behind the scenes actually done consolidation where I'm federation in name, but really I'm harvesting everything into one portal. And the truth is that federated search has a whole bunch of potential usability issues traditionally, like there's latency, so it can be slow. What happens if one of the nodes is down? I just don't get results from it. So there's always this attraction to kind of consolidate, right? To put everything in one kind of catalog. So traditionally, federation has ended up meaning things like, well, I've got a harvesting protocol, which is kind of federation, but not federation in the true sense. It's kind of a quasi-federation. So there's this kind of technical obstacles traditionally to doing proper federation, despite I've seen several attempts at it. that relates to, so I don't know, I guess as what I'm saying is that traditionally, like ultimately, for whether technical or usability reasons, while politically sometimes socially attractive, you've ended up with this kind of like some centralized node in a way. And on the second question of like what that means in terms of data quality and having data standard harvesting, whether AI allows us to kind of get around having to clean up data in advance, that's an open question. It would be marvelous in some ways if it did, because what standardization is one of those, you know, collective action problems, right? It's good if you're a harvester, you're harvesting other people, you'd love them to use the standard. But if they do, or to what extent, is hard, you know, hard to get adoption. So that's an open question. I don't want to offer too much thought on it, because we could go further. But say on the federation, I think it's one of those things that would be a nice idea, but often doesn't seem to happen. I am aware of time. I'm happy to keep answering questions, but I want to make sure that Pose and people get their updates, or whether we get to run a bit past the hour, or however you call it.
Well, normally
I can stay on.
Yeah, if
I
you
can stay on to
stay
answer
on,
questions
then,
afterwards, maybe, which is more respectful.
yes. Well, Bob, can you stay a bit longer?
Bob should maybe talk now, no, to present if you can.
We have many more questions. So there are questions in the chat. There are people with their hands on. So if Bob can stay a bit more, then we can continue. Maybe have 2-3 more questions, and then we can wrap it up.
Yeah, that sounds fine. And I'll just share a link in the chat if anybody does need to go, and I can hang on and talk more too.
Okay. Okay. Then whoever wants to drop, they can drop. We'll upload the recording, so everything is good. Okay, so let's go with Alex now. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Quick question, practical one. Coming from CKAN perspective, the pyramid of sense-making, right, and CKAN as infrastructure. How might CKAN evolve beyond the data management system and become more of a sense-making tool, like tool that caters to the end goal of the users? Is it a possibility you may foresee for this?
I don't know. I guess for CKAN, I think the dream and I think others have, is more of like how CKAN is already becoming, but data fabric or data infrastructure, you know, or at least part of, one of the things I see as CKAN is that CKAN can be has become, there are more and more kind of modularized in some regards, and so that I see it as kind of a part of building data infrastructure and data fabric for an enterprise or for an organization more generally. I mean, that would be one way that I see it. I'm not sure I need it to come all the way into other tools sensemaking. Like, I'm not sure CKAN needs to become a way I run my knowledge base, because we would end up with something, you know, it would become too big. So, you know, there are different things. For example, I'm working on a project called Flower Show, that's sort of this, you know, just very simple, like, you know, make Markdown public. But I think there are things like basically the data fabric end of things. And I also think for CKAN, ways that we can integrate, you know, some of the storytelling and other things. Those things are already there. I mean, there are ways to have blogs and other things or integrate, you know, that direction. And we've talked about like also headless CKAN, you know, using CKAN with, you know, things like Portal.js or other things like that. But this way of, I think, integrating content and data is a good way to go. But overall, I guess, Alex, my answer would be, I think if there's CKAN itself, and then there's this broader thing of seeing the ecosystem of data tooling, of knowledge tooling that is evolving, and that one is trying to, I guess, in my view, even if we're not using open data, which is fine, there are many organizations not with open data, how can we have more open data infrastructure? Because I think that's then valuable, that people kind of have the tools they can use to use things. But anyway, great question. Thank you.
Okay, Dinghe, you can go ahead. We can hear you. I think you're unmuted. Or that was by accident?
Yeah, sorry. That was
Oh,
by
okay.
accident. Sorry. Sorry.
Okay. Are there any other questions? There are two questions from Augusto in the chat. Augusto, if you're here, would you like to voice them or?
Sorry, I have renovations in the neighbor here, too loud noises.
It's pretty good, Augusto. We weren't hearing anything in the background. I could read your questions if you want me to respond to your questions in the chat.
It's okay. There were just a couple of questions about some problems that persist in open data despite so long time ago. And thank you for the presentation and for the mention. I was late for, I could just watch the end of your presentation because I had another meeting. But I was just asking about the public transit data in cities, and another one about
privacy.
Yeah.
Well, let me say something controversial about privacy, because I've actually published stuff on this. So I think the funny thing in the civic, what I call, there are two streams of people who got into what I would call information policy on the kind of public goods side over the last 20 years. One is I would call the digital rights type domain. So this is like EFF, electronic, even in the UK, I helped found the Open Rights Group. And then there's what I would call almost like, well, the open end or the consumer rights end. There's digital rights. So one are kind of concerned about civil rights in a digital age, privacy, freedom of speech, things like that. And the other group, which I'm really part of, is like, who owns the information age? Who has economic and therefore often social power in the information age? And that, my book, The Open Revolution, which came out in 2018, which was really written 2014, 2015, but it's really a summary of the view of like how we could have an information age that was fully open and we paid creators. Because the major problem, by the way, at the moment with most open stuff, including CKAN, is that basically you don't have enough funding often for it. It's getting better, but essentially compared to what you have often for a closed source model, it's tough. And so that book is mainly about like, how do you pay? How do capitalism and socialism have a baby, basically? Like, how can you have free access and open access to information, to movies, to music, to software, to medical patents, medical innovations, and pay for them at the level that we pay for them today? And you can read that book. It's mainly about how we implement remuneration rights. But the point I would say is that, ironically, I think privacy and personal data were a great own goal. Like, I'm personally not of course against privacy or not, but essentially I could see early on how privacy was going to get used as a way generally, both to restrict open data, but generally to prevent competition. So, Facebook might complain or Google might complain about privacy issues or like the right to be forgotten. But ultimately, that kind of legislation makes it much, much harder to start a startup to compete against those people. It's now really hard. Facebook will be, no, of course we can't give we can't share data with this other, social network startup because it's private and it's all this complicated. They may have consented to us when they signed up to give us their data, but of course they didn't sign up to give it to this other entity. So basically, if you care about economic monopolies in this area and technological monopolies, ironically, privacy and personal data legislation often has been, if anything, created obstacles and complexities in that way. And of course, we want privacy and so on in these areas. But the irony is, most people sign away a lot of their privacy to these massive tech giants most of the time anyway, on lots and lots of stuff. So the ultimate indirect thing, I mean, this happened about 100 years ago, by the way, when essentially the Federal Communications Commission in the United States essentially got captured by the dominant monopolies. From being there to kind of protect against monopolization, the FCC basically became something actually preventing competition and entry into the market. So this is a tough one, Augusto, but my basic point was that if you're interested actually in the more open end of things and how do we have an open information age, then actually you've got to be quite upfront and say, like, you're using privacy and personal data legislation as an excuse, and you might need to part ways with the digital rights community, frankly. And I think actually it would be a way to build a much bigger movement. I think there are many more people caring about inequality and economic injustice and a fair opportunity in the digital age than there are caring about privacy issues, frankly, actually. You know, people of course care about privacy, and they've been very sensitized about it. I don't want the NSA looking at my dick pics, but actually, you know, in terms of bread and butter, people having a job and things like that really matter to people. On point 2, basically this is old, right? This is just the fight for open data, which is hard. That many cities, as you say, share public transport with Google, but they don't publish them as open data. And you know, Google have teams, they have incentives. They don't actually pay people, but they're like, oh, it will show up on Google. You know, citizens complain if it's not on Google. If the bus timetable isn't Google, they don't care if it's not on OpenStreetMap. What would matter is to get more and more OpenStreetMap visibility. You know, the more that OpenStreetMap were used, that would be good. But these are hard things. And the basic answer to you, Augusto, in my view, and the conclusion why I wrote The Open Revolution, is until we solve the funding problem for open information goods, until you find a way to fund software, music, movies, pick whatever area at scale, at the kind of scale of current innovation funding, we will always be at a disadvantage. You'll kind of be a hacker community around the edge. And so the real aim was, the way you can start that is that you want to start basically creating pots of money. The idea in remuneration rights is you kind of combine the good things of a market and capitalism, which is that you give out money based on usage. You know, you have demand-based allocation of resources, that which creates incentives to create stuff people actually want, but with upfront funding. So the idea was even for open data would be like, okay, you get people to put money into a pot, and that pays for open data based on like the usage of that data by others. And that would also fund software. You know, one of the easier places to start, because governments already procure software, would be to persuade several municipalities in, say, Brazil or the United States, say, listen, put your money in a pot, or some of your money for like procuring software, maybe 10% of it to start with, in a pot of money. And that money is given out to software products that you, every year, based on what software products you actually are using. So there's no procurement. You just can go out and get them, but the money is given out to open source projects based on usage. It's like, you know, a usage thing, and that would be a revolution. I actually think the easiest place to maybe start it is for medicines, because people actually die when they don't have access to medicines, and increasingly that happens in quite a lot of countries in the world. It happens in Europe now. I mean, there are drugs that the NHS in England will not buy because they're so expensive under patent, and people die because they don't have the medicine. And you could have a model where you could say to the pharma companies, we will give you as much money as you give today. We will take all the money the NHS currently pay buying patented medicine, and we're going to put it in this fund, and the fund will give out, from now on, there won't be any pharmaceutical patents, but you will have a remuneration right. You'll be able to say, I came up with this medicine. I'm entitled to be paid from this fund every year based on how much my medicine is used and how many lives it saves. So you can really have this switch from basically patents or copyright-based funding models to remuneration rights funding models, which still allow for competition, still allow for VC investment, still allow for all the incentives that we like, but allow for open access and open reuse of material. But that is the ultimate way, in my view, to really switch to an open information age. And I finished by pointing out that it's so attractive that people do it indirectly. So Spotify, who can remember iTunes? iTunes, it was pay per track, 99 cents per track. Whether you did it or not, that it was in theory 99 cents a track. Now, Spotify said, no, you're going to pay a fixed fee and it's all you can eat. That is the model I'm talking about. We pay fixed fees to our taxes. We pay, for example, $10 a month, or $5 a month actually would be equivalent in our mobile internet bill, and music is open in our country. Anyone can supply it, anyone can download it, and so on. And all that money that's paid every month goes to creators in the same way Spotify distributes it based on plays or something. We can do that. So it's so attractive that the Netflix and Spotify model takes over in certain areas. But you just don't want it run by a monopolist like Spotify or Netflix in the long run. But that model is super, super, super attractive. And the basic idea is to have that run at a democratic state level. And that is all in the Open Revolution, which is downloadable for free at openrevolution.net. And we got quite far before I ran out of steam and I moved into life itself more and running Datopian. In 2017, 2018, we had funding from Rockefeller Foundation, and we went to quite a few European governments. So there was interest in the medical idea. It just requires about a decade of work to actually get a government to adopt something. But there is interest in this idea, and I think it has real legs, because unlike most ideas, you can promise the creative industries, whether you like them or not, you know, and the pharmaceutical industry, you can offer them as much money as they have today. And, you know, in general, trying to go and reform IP, intellectual property is like going up to a very hungry big bear and trying to take a fish away from them. It's like freaking hard, right? It's like, it's basically unwinnable in the last 200 years. For the last 200 years, the IP, the content industries have always won on almost every extension of IP. And so trying to fight them head on is really, really hard, even if they're abusing the system frequently. But if you said to them, look, you're going to get as much as today, but we're going to make the switch, and even better, we'll make it more politically, you know, you won't get attacked and people won't hate you and won't steal your films online as much. Well, there won't even be copyright infringement anymore because you'll just get paid. This would be attractive. So that's the way I think to go in the medium term. So someone who wants to dedicate about 10 years of their life to policy work, that's what I would be going to do. And I think there's funding for that out there for that idea, but it requires dedication.
Do you think the crowdfunding model could work also for data? Here in Brazil, Open Lodge Brazil have a project, the civil society called Querido Diário. They take the official gazettes of hundreds of cities and then offer it as data API. That's...
Listen, like crowdfunding, Kickstarter, and even stuff like GitHub, open source system, and, you know, like, all these things are good and there's nothing wrong with them. But if you just look at like how much just gets spent on Kickstarter or on crowdfunding compared to get spent on innovation last year, like what the R&D budgets are of like most of the companies and of society as a whole compared to crowdfunding, it's just like, you know, it's just orders of magnitude different in the amount of it is. Or you looked at the NIH budget, you know, National Institute of Health R&D budget essentially compared to crowdfunding. I mean, it's just not on the same scale. And so, you know, I also think, you know, basically open source to a large extent, quite a lot of open source today, I joke, is like subsists on crumbs from the tables of the giants. You know, like Facebook kicks a bit of money over, Google kick a bit of money over, you know, the open source and free software is incredible, but based on very limited funding or government funding. You know, like if you trace it back, much software gets some kind of government funding, which is good. I mean, it's a good thing that it happens most open source. But I'm just saying, I don't think those are complements and they're helpful, but really, if we want to switch to an open information society, we need to get the state involved in this kind of remuneration right type model. That's the only way you get to the kind of scale of funding that you're talking about. That's my view. And it's possible. What I want to say is it's possible. You know, there are collecting societies, inefficient if they are, as they are potentially, but we have collecting societies. I am aware of time, so I just want to take you on, and I have to jump quite soon, but I just want to check if like Bob or anyone wants to gone over time a little bit here. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Did somebody wanted to say something? No. Okay. Yeah, let's finish this very interesting discussion. Thank you, Rufus, and thank you to everyone who joined today. These were very powerful reflections. It was a mix of personal journey, deep questions, and real food for thought. And I'm very thankful that I had the privilege of listening. Now let's have Bob, if he's still here.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, you have the mic.
Yeah, thanks. So you may remember a few years ago, we received funding here in the US, and I'm at the University of Pittsburgh. We received funding through a NSF project, Pathway to Enabling Open Source Ecosystems, and we did a whole phase 1 discovery effort. We were funded second half of last year for 2 years to start to build a lot of the new things that people wanted to see. So we have a couple of listening sessions coming up in June that we'd love to see you at. So if you have ideas for the kind of things that you can create or would like to create in the CKAN ecosystem, we'd love to have you join us and hear from you. That could be everything from user groups, community of practice, training for things like storytelling that we heard about a little bit earlier. Maybe training in how to talk about CKAN and open source software among potential funders. So we want to hear all the ideas that you have so we can start to help you implement those here in CKAN. So thanks. And I just posted those links in the chat.
I was saying, Bob, fantastic. I'm going to say, I mean, obviously I know about all you've been doing in Post, but I'm so, yeah, amazing. And thank you and the team and everyone who's contributing. Yeah, really.
No, it's been a great experience to be part of this, and really glad that we can, like finally found the opportunity to get back a little bit.
Thank you, and we can share on social media and make some noise. Okay, so we have some closing notes. So before I say goodbye, I need just 2 minutes. Rufus is sharing some links. You can have a look at the chat. So yeah, if you want to have a talk at CKAN Monthly Live, you can fill out the form that you see on the screen, or you can write an email directly to me. As you know, we are always on the lookout for engaging CKAN-related projects. So if you're working on something interesting, share it with the community. In our meeting notes document, there is a special section for where you can suggest topics and speakers. If you just have a topic, you can suggest it and we'll accommodate a speaker. We'll do our best. Don't forget to subscribe for our newsletter. Link is available in this presentation and also on our website. And you can subscribe for our LinkedIn edition as well. It's monthly and it's interesting. If you need help or you want to get involved, you can go to ckan.org/community. You'll find all the available links there to GitHub discussions, to the weekly dev meetings, and many other useful stuff. Yes, all the links in the chat will be also in the meeting notes document, and usually, yeah, so in the meeting notes document. Also, I do provide some links in the recording. Under the YouTube video, you will also find some useful stuff there. Yeah, if you find this valuable, we can stay connected on social media. The Gitter chat is very active for developer-related questions. And also we have LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. If you want to watch the session again, like if you want to revisit, or if you want to share it with your network, it will be available very soon on our YouTube channel. And as I said, all relevant links will be in the video description. And with that being said, thanks again for joining us today. Thanks to Rufus, that was amazing, and it sparked really great conversation. See you at the next CKAN Monthly Live, and till we meet again, keep those data fires burning. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.